I am Crafty Andy, and you should be subscribed to this main channel here that we're at right now, Crafty Arts. New videos in the works as always now at this point. More or less trying to get at least one or two out every other week, or at least within the month. You know, as long as they're edited well and presented well, that's primarily what I'm focused on, because I think in the long run that's going to make more of a difference than just me pumping out a bunch of garbage and being completely dismissed by everyone that comes across this channel. You know, the numbers won't matter much if no one's remotely interested in actually seeing what's going on. Anyways, guys, the furry channel here, Weird Zors. As always, new videos are on the works there. Pause off. Things are starting to line up there. Just gotta make some time to get some work done there too. But we got live streams all throughout the week for that. With a talking weasel, freeloader, squigs. Anywho, I see there's some people in here, so appreciate you. Get the static off here. Get my camera. Get the web zone up, or display up, I should say. So I was just enjoying a re-listen of the People's History of the United States. Probably like the ultimate history lesson of the United States. From Audio Anarchy, which is pretty damn good at doing voices, English teacher. So yeah, we're in the middle of the first chapter here. And then we're heading on to the second one today. Hopefully probably get through both.
Or courts or
Not most of them are not that long. Most of them are just about an hour and a half. So wait, let's figure this out. 22 videos, 24 videos. Most are an hour and a half. 24 hours. Say like 36. About 38 hours. Yeah, damn. Long read.
jails, the apparatus. A society of rich and poor, controlled by priests, by governors, by male heads of families. For example, the pastor of the Pilgrim Colony, John Robinson, thus advised his parishioners on how to deal with their
Get my
children.
camera going.
Quote, "And surely there is in all children a stubbornness and stoutness of mind arising from natural pride, which must, in the first place, be broken and beaten down, that so the foundation of their education being laid in humility and tractableness, other virtues may, in their time, be built thereon." Gary Nash. So Fillion just basically went through the truth of Columbus's expedition, the results of that, and then right now he's just reading off a quote from a priest whose method of teaching children is just to beat the shit out of them, as you do. As you do. Alright. Anywho, we're trying to pay attention to the chat here with my phone. Ash describes Iroquois culture. Quote, "No laws and ordinances, sheriffs and constables, judges and juries, or courts
Stick around
or
and learn
jails,
something.
the apparatus of authority in European societies, were to be found in the northeast woodlands prior to European arrival. Yet boundaries of acceptable behavior were firmly set. Though priding themselves on the autonomous individual, the Iroquois maintained a strict sense of right and wrong. He who stole another's food or acted invalorously in war was shamed by his people and ostracized from their company until he had atoned for his actions and demonstrated to their satisfaction that he had morally purified himself. Unquote. Not only the Iroquois, but other Indian tribes behaved the same way. In 1635, Maryland Indians responded to the governor's demand that if any of them killed an Englishman, the guilty one should be delivered up for punishment according to English law. The Indians said, quote,
Shit, where's my...
"It is the manner among us Indians that if any such accident happen, we do redeem the life of a man that is so slain with a 100 arms length of beads. And since you are here strangers and come into our country, you should rather conform yourselves to the customs of our country than impose yours upon us."
What? That sounds logical. Better kill him.
So Columbus and his successors were not coming into an empty wilderness, but into a world which in some places was as densely populated as Europe itself, where the...
What do you mean? No, they weren't utilizing the land properly, as they say. Correct?
Sounds logical. And successors. Empty
Alright, so I got this ink. It was a little thick, having trouble getting it out of the nib, so put some water in it. Hopefully that'll soften it up a bit. Hopefully not too much, otherwise I'm fucked. Well, I got more ink. Alright. Let's not drop it anywhere. Continue with the lesson.
Culture was complex, where human relations were more egalitarian than in Europe, and where the relations among men, women, children, and nature were more beautifully worked out than perhaps any place in the world. They were people without a written language, but with their own laws, their poetry, their history kept in memory and passed on, in an oral vocabulary more complex than Europe's, accompanied by song, dance, and ceremonial drama. They paid careful attention to the development of personality, intensity of will,
yeah, it sounds like communism,
and flexibility, passion and potency to their partnership with one another and with nature.
Everything's communism, everything's Satan, and you gotta point it out.
John Collier, an American scholar who lived among Indians in the 1920s and 1930s in the American Southwest, said of their spirit, quote, "Could we make it our own, there would be an eternally inexhaustible earth and a forever lasting peace." Unquote. Perhaps there is some romantic mythology in that. But the evidence from European travelers in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, put together recently by an American specialist on Indian life, William Brandon, is overwhelmingly supportive of much of that myth. Even allowing for the imperfection of myths, it is enough to make us question, for that time and ours, the excuse of progress in the annihilation of races, and the telling of history
and
from the
races that are made up,
of
by
the
the way,
conquerors and leaders of Western civilization. So ends Chapter 1 of A People's History of the United States. As always, I'll go ahead and leave you with my thoughts.
What a banger to start.
First of all, excellent work. In my humble opinion, Howard Zinn is obviously a classic. This is my first time reading this particular work, though. So this is very off the cuff. I think one of my first criticisms is that it is pretty rough to be reading a history of Native Americans as written here by a white American descended from settler colonialists, but who's writing on, via a degree earned from a university built on stolen land by the very stealers of that land. And there is a
who else is going to write it This came out in like the 80s, I think, before it was updated later to include like the war on terror and shit. I mean, like, what are you gonna do? I mean, just because you're native too, like you have native heritage, doesn't mean like you just automatically like magically know the history. It's kind of like I don't know who's going to know the history of conquering. Then the well, see, like even if you go like there to account for it, that doesn't make you automatically qualified or accurate. You might omit things. So just a weird, just a weird thing. Honestly, I think it distracts from the overall point the work is going for already, which is, just essentially an honest to God look at what the fuck the actual history was and the actions taken by those before us.
Even Howard Zinn puts it this way, mythologizing this idyllic, perfect past, which, in terms of post-colonial thought, is not ideal. You don't want to look back and say, oh, yes, Native American society was utopian. Because utopia is not really what it was. There were conflicts and hardships and
I don't think he's saying that either.
You don't want to erase that and pretend that as they say in social justice, there are no perfect victims. But the problem isn't that Europe wiped out a utopia. The problem is that Europe wiped out a people. By wiped out, I should clarify, there are still Native Americans. They're not entirely killed, but not for lack of trying, the Europeans, let's say, devastated populations. I mean, we're talking in the 90, 95, 99 percentiles. It's unbelievable, the scope of the bloodshed. Utopian or not, that is a horrible, horrific crime whose consequences echo even into today.
That is all correct.
Will
I got nothing to say.
Beyond today. I like that Howard Zinn outlines a lot of the accomplishments and achievements and progress and like civilizational, advancements happening in the Americas, Central America and South America and North America as well. To sort of counter this European narrative in the history books of like civilization coming to the Americas via Europeans and progress, which is an argument you still hear today. Like, yes, well, we wouldn't have the things we have today without these settlements. And perhaps not, and who can say what a butterfly effect, we're dealing with there. But Zinn shows just precisely
we would have less toys.
How developed a lot all of these civilizations were.
Right, that's what it comes down to. It's just like, oh no, if it wasn't for all those colonials, we wouldn't have what we have today. Oh yes, a whole bunch of bullshit. A whole bunch of technology that's slowly getting fucking worse with each generation at this point. The shitification of everything. Oh no. It might have taken a little longer to get that engine, get that car going. Might have taken a little bit longer for the internet. Something like it. Or color TVs, etc. Whoop. Always the challenge with this is that I always seem to get too much ink
encroachment and slaughter and bloodshed. And this is of particular interest to me. I'm from Virginia, and there, in Virginia history, when I was in elementary school, 3rd to 5th grade, somewhere in there, we learned about Columbus, obviously, that was super whitewashed. But, there's certainly none of the, instantly thinking about how he could subjugate the people he came across. But also, we learned about the Iroquois, but so little. I remember the Iroquois being a large civilization that built and lived in longhouses.
That's about it.
And helped provide food for the settlers until conflict arose. That's literally what I learned about
Yeah, that's pretty much how it's described.
The Iroquois in elementary school. That they had a I don't want to say communistic society, because communism is a kind of a product of Karl Marx, and obviously they developed that independently of Marx. But I would say the idea of public property and common ownership is an idea that I wish we lived by now. One of the many things that are honestly progressive that the Europeans wiped out in the name of progress. And so much about the structure and roles in Iroquois society that Howard Zinn goes over here very briefly, in comparison to how you could outline an entire society, seems extremely manageable to teach in elementary school. And yet,
well, no, because then they might hate America for some reason.
When I was
not think of ways to improve it or anything, just just hate it.
Or when I was 12, 23 years ago, much of this was not taught to me. And why not? Because we have to reckon with our own complicity as American citizens.
Guilt. You gotta be guilty.
The obvious criticism here is, again, Howard Zinn's voice the best to be telling, the history of the Iroquois people, or describing the structure of Iroquois society?
I don't know.
No, it's not. Now, of course, this book is published in 1980, and at that point, it's hard to break through the publishing industry unless you're a white man. It's still hard to break through the publishing industry unless you're a white man.
It's still hard to break in the publishing industry in general, especially if you're not a white man.
I plan on reading just independently. I don't know if I'll make an audiobook for it, but it is literally called An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. You may wish to look into that if you'd like to read a more authoritative voice than Zinn's. Obviously, the language of the book is a bit dated. Indians is not a term that has any accuracy. And Zinn says in his book, too often people are given the names that their conquerors give them. Well, Zinn, maybe look into it and have some consultants, like some consulting Native Americans who could maybe give you some guidance on.
Well, what's hilarious about that is that some prefer just adopted the term Indian, and some don't. Depends who you talk to. That's at least what I've gathered. What I've read up on is some of them just adopted it as their own. Okay, fine. Kind of like how faggots like us took back the word faggot because, we are that. It's I am that, and what are you gonna do about it? Not let it hurt you anymore. You wear it like armor. Give you a name, take it, and make it your own.
Put that in a footnote. It's not that hard. Anyhow, I was planning on making this the first 3 chapters, but it seems that the first chapter is plenty long. That's gonna do it for me. Go ahead and get out there and seize the means of production, my little anarchist friends.
Yeah, good luck with your purity politics.
This recording is a product of Audio Anarchy. Now, before I get started with this reading, I'd like to issue a bit of a content warning.
Don't spoil me. Just read it.
Depictions of violence, sexual violence, slavery, racial violence, and racism.
God damn it.
It also features the use of words that are pretty commonly known to be slurs.
Win.
That said, if you're willing to carry on, carry on. A People's History of the United States.
Spoil it for me. You can't just like say what you're going to have in there.
Chapter 2.
Just give a general warning.
The color line. A Black American writer, J. Saunders Redding, describes the arrival of a ship in North America in the year 1619. Quote, "Sails furled, flag drooping at her rounded stern, she rode the tide in from the sea. She was a strange ship indeed, by all accounts, a frightening ship, a ship of mystery. Whether she was trader, privateer, or man of war, no one knows. Through her bulwarks, black-mouthed cannon yawned. The flag she flew was Dutch, her crew a motley. Her port of call an English settlement, Jamestown, in the colony of Virginia. She came, she traded, and shortly afterwards was gone. Probably no ship in modern history has carried a more portentous freight. Her cargo, 20 slaves." There is not a country in world history in which racism has been more important for so long a time as the United States. And the problem of the color line, as W.E.B. Du Bois put it, is still with us. So it is more than a purely historical question.
I mean, there was a time when Italians, you go down the line, Italians were considered subhuman. Irish had their own like stereotypes imposed on them. They were considered less than when it came to like the British. Well, by the British, of course. Why is ink had such a hard time coming off the nib? It really is sticky. Got other inks, but I figured I might as well use the one it came with. Anyways.
Question to ask, how does it start? And an even more urgent question, how might it end? Or, to put it differently, is it possible for whites and blacks to live together without hatred? If history can help answer these questions, then the beginnings of slavery in North America, a continent where we can trace the coming of the first whites and the first blacks, might supply at least a few clues. Some historians think those first blacks in Virginia were considered as servants, like the white indentured servants brought from Europe, but the strong probability is that even if they were listed as servants, a more familiar category to the English, they were viewed as being different from white servants, were treated differently, and in fact were slaves. In any case, slavery developed quickly into a regular institution, into the normal labor relation of blacks to whites in the New World, With it developed that special racial feeling, whether hatred or contempt or pity or patronization, that accompanied the inferior position of blacks in America for the next 350 years. That combination of inferior status and derogatory thought we call racism. Everything in the experience of the first white settlers acted as a pressure for the enslavement of blacks. The Virginians of 1619 were desperate for labor to grow enough food to stay alive. Among them were survivors from the winter of 1609 to 1610, the starving time, when, crazed for want of food, they roamed the woods for nuts and berries, dug up graves to eat the corpses, and died in batches until 500 colonists were reduced to 60. In the Journals of the House of Burgesses of Virginia is a document of 1619, which tells of the first 12 years of the Jamestown colony. The first settlement had 100 persons, who had one small ladle of barley per meal. When more people arrived, there was even less food. Many of the people lived in cave-like holes dug into the ground, and in the winter of 1609 to 1610 they were, quote, driven through insufferable hunger to eat those things which nature most abhorred, the flesh and excrements of man, as well of our own nation as of an Indian, digged by some out of his grave after he had lain buried 3 days, and wholly devoured him. Others, envying the better state of body of any whom hunger has not yet so much wasted as their own, lay wait and threatened to kill and eat them. One among them slew his wife as she slept in his bosom, cut her in pieces, salted her, and fed upon her, till he had clean devoured all parts, saving her head. A petition.
I don't know if he gets too much in detail of the colonial life, but yeah, that's pretty much it right there. A bunch of mainly people labeled as lowlives and undesirables, just tossed over to the colonies and said, good luck, make a life for yourselves here. And even after everything was said and done, those that survive, most of the time they didn't get to keep their land. Or keep the land that they stole, basically, in many cases. It's hard to fucking even, like, comprehend, like, the idea that you and your family just live in a hole in the ground, if you have one. And daddy's looking at you like a fucking meal. Because the hunger is taking him so hard, it's driving him mad.
By 30 colonists to the House of Burgesses, complaining against the 12-year governorship of Sir Thomas Smith, said, in those 12 years of Sir Thomas Smith, his government, we aver that the colony, for the most part, remained in great want and misery, under most severe and cruel laws. The allowance in those times for a man was only 8 ounces of meal, and half a pint of peas for a day, mouldy, rotten, full of cobwebs and maggots, loathsome to man and not fit for beasts, which forced many to flee for relief to the savage enemy, who, being taken again, were put to sundry deaths, as by hanging, shooting, and breaking upon the wheel. Of whom one, for stealing 2 or 3 pints of oatmeal, had a bodkin thrust through his tongue, and was tied with a chain to a tree until he starved. The Virginians needed labor to grow corn for subsistence, to grow tobacco for export.
Once again, what a lovely species.
They just figured out how to grow tobacco, and in 1617, they sent off the first cargo to England. finding that, like all pleasurable drugs tainted with moral disapproval, it brought a high price. The planters, despite their high religious talk, were not going to ask questions about something so profitable. They couldn't force the Indians to work for them as Columbus had done. They were outnumbered, and while with superior firearms they could massacre Indians, they would face massacre in return. They could not capture them and keep them enslaved. The Indians were tough, resourceful, defiant, and at home in these woods, as the transplanted Englishmen were not. White servants had not yet been brought over in sufficient quantity. Besides, they did not come out of slavery and did not have to do more than contract their labor for a few years to get their passage and a start in the New World. As for the free white settlers, many of them were skilled craftsmen or even men of leisure back in England, who were so little inclined to work the land that John Smith in those early years had to declare a kind of martial law, organize them into work gangs, and force them into the fields for survival. There may have been a kind of frustrated rage at their own ineptitude, at the Indian superiority at taking care of themselves, that made the Virginians especially ready to become the masters of slaves. Edmund Morgan imagines their mood as he writes in his book, American Slavery, America.
I don't know if he says it in here. One of the contentions that was against slavery was like, well, if we let people have slaves, they'll just get lazy. They'll expect the slaves to do all the work, and they won't do the work. They won't know the benefit of hard labor. All right, my dog's barking. I should probably see what it is. All right.
American freedom. If you were a colonist, you knew that your technology was superior to the Indians. You knew that you were civilized and they were savages. But your superior technology had proved insufficient to extract anything. The Indians, keeping to themselves, laughed at your superior methods and lived from the land more abundantly and with less labor than you did. And when your own people started deserting in order to live with them, it was too much. So you killed the Indians, tortured them, burned their villages, burned their cornfields. It proved your superiority in spite of your failures. And you gave similar treatment to any of your own people who succumbed to their savage ways of life. But you still did not grow much corn. Black slaves were the answer. And it was natural to consider imported blacks as slaves, even if the institution of slavery would not be regularized and legalized for several decades. Because by 1619, 1 million blacks had already been brought from Africa to South America and the Caribbean to the Portuguese and Spanish colonies to work as slaves. 50 years before Columbus, the Portuguese took 10 African blacks to Lisbon. This was the start of a regular trade in slaves. African blacks had been stamped as slave labor for 100 years. So it would have been strange if those 20 blacks forcibly transported to Jamestown and sold as objects to settlers anxious for a steadfast source of labor were considered as anything but slaves. Their helplessness made enslavement easier. The Indians were on their own land. The whites were in their own European culture. The blacks had been torn from their land and culture, forced into a situation where the heritage of language, dress, custom, family relations was bit by bit obliterated, except for the remnants that blacks could hold on to by sheer extraordinary persistence. Was their culture
basically
inferior and so subject to easy destruction? Inferior in military capability, yes. Vulnerable to whites with guns and ships, but in no other way. Except that cultures that are different are often taken as inferior, especially when such a judgment is practical and profitable. Even militarily, while the Westerners could secure forts on the African coast, they were unable to subdue the interior and had to come to terms with its chiefs. The African civilization was as advanced in its own way as that of Europe. In certain ways, it was more admirable, but it also included cruelties, hierarchical privilege, and the readiness to sacrifice human lives for religion or profit. It was a civilization of 100 million people, using iron implements and skilled in farming. It had large urban centers and remarkable achievements in weaving, ceramics, sculpture. European travelers in the 16th century were impressed with the African kingdoms of Timbuktu and Mali, already stable and organized at a time when European states were just beginning to develop into the modern nation. In 1563, Ramusio, secretary to the rulers in Venice, wrote to the Italian merchants, "Let them go and do business with the king of Timbuktu and Mali, and there is no doubt that they will be well received there, with their ships and their goods, and treated well, and granted the favors that they ask." A Dutch report around 1602 on the West African kingdom of Benin said, "The town seemeth to be very great. When you enter it, you go into a great broad street, not paved, which seemeth to be 7 or 8 times broader than the Warmoes Street in Amsterdam. The houses in this town stand in good order, one close and even with the other, as the houses in Holland stand." The inhabitants of the Guinea coast were described by one traveler around 1680 as, quote, "very civil and good-natured people, easy to be dealt with, condescending to what Europeans require of them in a civil way, and very ready to return double the presents we make them," unquote. Africa had a kind of feudalism, like Europe, based on agriculture, and with hierarchies of lords and vassals, but African feudalism did not come, as did Europe's, out of the slave societies of Greece and Rome, which had destroyed ancient tribal life. In Africa, tribal life was still powerful, and some of its better features, a communal spirit, more kindness in law and punishment, still existed. And because the lords did not have the weapons that European lords had, they could not command obedience as easily. In his book, The African Slave Trade, Basil Davidson contrasts law in the Congo in the early 16th century with law in Portugal and England. In those European countries where the idea of private property was becoming powerful, theft was punished brutally. In England, even as late as 1740, a child could be hanged for stealing a rag of cotton. But in the Congo, communal life persisted. The idea of having private property was a strange one, and thefts were punished with fines or various degrees of servitude. A Congolese leader told of the Portuguese legal codes, asked a Portuguese once teasingly, "What is the penalty in Portugal for anyone who puts his feet on the ground?" Slavery existed in the African states, and it was sometimes used by Europeans to justify their own slave trade. But as Davidson points out, the, quote, slaves, unquote, of Africa were more like the serfs of Europe. In other words, like most of the population of Europe. It was a harsh servitude, but they had rights, which slaves brought to America did not have, and they were, quote, altogether different from the human cattle of the slave ships and the American plantations, unquote.
Yeah, I bet it's preferable.
In the Ashanti Kingdom of West Africa, one observer noted that, quote, a slave
what?
A slave might marry, own property, himself own a slave, swear an oath, be a competent witness, and ultimately become heir to his master. An Ashanti slave, 9 cases out of 10, possibly became an adopted member of the family, and in time, his descendants so merged and intermarried with the owner's kinsmen that only a few would know their origin. One
and why would they care what their origin was?
Who later became an anti-slavery leader, wrote about the people of what is now Sierra Leone. Quote, the state of slavery among these wild, barbarous people, as we esteem them, is much milder than in our colonies. For, as on the one hand they have no land in high cultivation like our West India plantations, and therefore no call for that excessive, unintermitted labor which exhausts our slaves, so, on the other hand, no man is permitted to draw blood, even from a slave. African slavery is hardly to be praised, but it was far different from plantation or mining slavery in the Americas, which was lifelong, morally crippling, destructive of family ties, without hope of any future. African slavery lacked 2 elements that made American slavery the most cruel form of slavery in history.
Racism
the
was one.
Frenzy for limitless profit that comes from capitalistic agriculture, the reduction of the slave to less than human status by the use of racial hatred
using a plastic
with that relentless clarity based on color, where white was master, black
I think I had a
was
plastic
slave.
ruler.
In fact, it was because they came from a settled culture of tribal customs and family ties, of communal life and traditional ritual, that African blacks found themselves especially helpless when removed from this. They were captured in the interior,
this will work.
frequently by blacks caught up in the slave trade themselves, sold on the coast, then shoved into pens with blacks of other tribes, often speaking different languages. The conditions of capture and sale were crushing affirmations to the black African of his helplessness in the face of superior force. The marches to the coast, sometimes for 1,000 miles, with people shackled around the neck under whip and gun, were death marches, in which 2 of every 5 blacks died. On the coast, they were kept in cages until they were picked and sold. One John Barbet, at the end of the 17th century, described these cages on the Gold Coast. As the slaves come down to feeder from the inland country, they are put into a booth or prison near the beach, and when the Europeans are to receive them, they are brought out onto a large plain where the ship's surgeons examine every part of them, to the smallest member, men and women being stark naked. Some are allowed good, and some are set on one side, marked on the breast with a red-hot iron, imprinting the mark of the French, English, or Dutch companies. The branded slaves, after this, are returned to their former booths.
This is so fucking casual.
Shipment, sometimes 10 to 15 days. Then they were packed aboard the slave ships, in spaces not much bigger than coffins, chained together in the dark, wet slime of the ship's bottom, choking in the stench of their own excrement. Documents of the time describe the conditions. The height, sometimes, between decks was only 18 inches, so that the unfortunate human beings could not turn around, or even on their sides, the elevation being less than the breadth of their shoulders. And here they are usually chained to the decks by the neck and legs. In such a place, the sense of misery and suffocation is so great that the Negroes are driven to frenzy. On one occasion, hearing a great noise from below decks where the blacks were chained together, the sailors opened the hatches and found the slaves in different stages of suffocation. Many dead.
Goddamn.
Some having killed others in desperate attempts to breathe. Slaves often jumped overboard to drown rather than continue their suffering. To one observer, a slave deck was, quote, so covered with blood and mucus that it resembled a slaughterhouse, unquote. Under these conditions, perhaps one of every 3 blacks transported...
It's just so fucking insane to think about it, too. It's just like... You're treating these people like they're fucking cargo. And it's almost like they're surprised that a lot of them just fucking die off. They wouldn't be treating their fucking livestock animals this way. I just don't understand. I was trying to get a grip of, like, what was the mentality? Because, like, again, you wouldn't be treating livestock that way. So, what? Were they just, like, guesstimating, like, how many would just die on the way there and figure, like, well... You know, as long as we get at least 50, 20 there, we're good.
Overseas died. But the huge profits, often double the investment on one trip, made it worthwhile for the slave trader, and so the blacks were packed into the holds like fish.
That's it? Just money.
First,
there you go.
Dutch, then the English dominated the slave trade. By 1795,
there's my answer.
Liverpool had more than 100 ships carrying
the money was worth it,
and accounted for half of all the European slave trade. Some Americans in New England entered the business, and in 1637, the first American slave ship, the Desire, sailed from Marblehead. Its holds were partitioned into racks 2 feet by 6 feet, with leg irons and bars. By 1800, 10 to 15 million blacks had been transported as slaves to the Americas, representing perhaps 1/3 of those originally seized in Africa. It is roughly estimated that Africa lost 50 million human beings to death and slavery in those centuries we call the beginnings of modern Western civilization, at the hands of slave traders and plantation owners in Western Europe and America, the countries deemed the most advanced in the world. In the year 1610, a Catholic priest in the Americas named Father Sandoval wrote back to a church functionary in Europe to ask if the capture, transport, and enslavement of African blacks was legal by church doctrine. A letter dated March 12, 1610, from Brother Luis Brandeon to Father Sandoval gives the answer. Your Reverence writes me that you would like to know whether the Negroes who are sent to your parts have been legally captured. To this I reply that I think your Reverence should have no scruples on this point, because this is a matter which has been questioned by the Board of Conscience in Lisbon, and all its members are learned and conscientious men. Nor did the bishops who were in Sao Tome, Cape Verde, and here in Loando, all learned and virtuous men, find fault with it. We have been here ourselves for 40 years, and there have been among us very learned fathers. Never did they consider the trade as illicit. Therefore, we and the fathers of Brazil
Good for
buy
them.
these slaves for our service without any scruple. With all of this, the desperation of Jamestown settlers for labor, the impossibility of using Indians, and the difficulty of using whites, the availability of blacks offered in greater and greater numbers by profit-seeking dealers in human flesh, and with such blacks possible to control because they had just gone through an ordeal which, if it did not kill them, must have left them in a state of psychic and physical helplessness. Is it any wonder that such blacks were ripe for enslavement? And under these conditions,
Yeah, anything better than what they're going through right now.
Some blacks might have been considered servants. Would blacks be treated the same as white servants? The evidence from the court records of colonial Virginia shows that in 1630, a white man named Hugh Davis was ordered, quote, to be soundly whipped for abusing himself by defiling his body in lying with a Negro, unquote. 10 years later, 6 servants and, quote, a Negro of Mr. Reynolds, unquote, started to run away, while the whites received lighter sentences, quote, Emmanuel the Negro to receive 30 stripes, and to be burnt in the cheek with the letter R, and to work in shackle 1 year or more, as his master shall see cause, unquote. Although slavery was not yet regularized or legalized in those first years, the lists of servants show blacks listed separately. A law passed in 1639 decreed that, quote, all persons except Negroes, unquote, were to get arms and ammunition, probably to fight off Indians. When in 1640, 3 servants tried to run away, the 2 whites were punished with a lengthening of their service. But, as the court put it, quote, the third, being a Negro named John Punch, shall serve his master or his assigns for the time of his natural life, unquote.
Okay.
Also in 1640, we have the case of a Negro woman servant who begot a child by Robert.
Can you imagine? Like, you're just sentenced to serve this person for, like, the rest of your life. I don't know about you, but that doesn't seem like an ideal situation for either of those folks, because it's like, oh yeah, this is Bob. He's assigned to me for life. Like, I think you'd be plotting your death immediately. Why not? Anything's better than being stuck with this, you know, with an asshole for the rest of your life, right? Just insane. How was Robert Sir Fuckard poisoned? Yeah, well, they didn't have the methods back then, so really you could just be like, well, how did Sir Fucker die? Yeah, I guess it was lead poisoning or something. I don't know. Nothing in the food. See, the food was fine. How did he get this dent in his head? Oh, it fell down the stairs, I guess.
Robert Sweat, a white man. The court ruled, quote, that the said Negro woman shall be whipped at the whipping post, and the said Sweat shall tomorrow in the forenoon do public penance for his offense at James City Church, unquote. This unequal treatment, this developing combination of contempt and oppression, feeling and action, which we call racism, was this the result of a natural antipathy of white against black? The question is important, not just as a matter of historical accuracy, but because any emphasis on natural racism lightens the responsibility of the social system. If racism can't be shown to be natural, then it is the result of certain conditions, and we are impelled to eliminate those conditions. We have no way of testing the behavior of whites and blacks toward one another under favorable conditions. With no history of subordination, no money incentive for exploitation and enslavement, no desperation for survival requiring forced labor, all the conditions for black and white in 17th century America were the opposite of that. All powerfully directed toward antagonism and mistreatment. Under such conditions, even the slightest display of humanity between the races might be considered evidence of a basic human drive toward community. Sometimes it is noted that even before 1600, when the slave trade had just begun, before Africans were stamped by it, literally and symbolically, the color black was distasteful. In England, before 1600, it meant, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, quote, deeply stained with dirt, soiled, dirty, foul, having dark or deadly purposes, malignant, pertaining to or involving death, deadly, baneful, disastrous, sinister, foul, iniquitous, atrocious, horribly wicked, indicating disgrace, censure, liability to punishment, etc.
At one point you're just like, I get it.
And Elizabethan poetry often used the color white in connection with beauty. It may be that, in the absence of any other overriding factor, darkness and blackness associated with night and unknown would take on those meanings, but the presence of another human being is a powerful fact, and the conditions of that presence are crucial in determining whether an initial prejudice against a mere color divorced from humankind is turned into brutality and hatred. In spite of such preconceptions about blackness, in spite of special subordination of blacks in the Americas,
labeled their color ebony.
Century, there is evidence that where whites and blacks found themselves with common problems, common work, common enemy in their master, they behaved toward one another as equals.
Oh yeah, this was fascinating.
One scholar of slavery, Kenneth Stamp, has put it, Negro and white servants of the 17th century were remarkably unconcerned about the visible physical differences. Black and white
class solidarity
fraternized together. The very fact that laws had to be passed after a while to forbid such relations indicates the strength.
Yeah, they don't want the poors to unite and realize they outnumber the rich.
That tendency. In 1661, a law was passed in Virginia that, quote, in case any English servant shall run away in company of any Negroes, unquote, he would have to give special service for extra years to the master of the runaway Negro. In 1691, Virginia provided for the banishment of any, quote, white man or woman being free, who shall intermarry with a Negro, mulatto, or Indian man or woman, bond or free, unquote. There is an enormous difference between a feeling of racial strangeness, perhaps fear, and the mass enslavement of millions of black people that took place in the Americas. The transition from one to the other cannot be explained easily by natural tendencies. It is not hard to understand as the outcome of historical conditions. Slavery grew as the plantation system grew. The reason is easily traceable to something other than natural racial repugnance. The number of arriving whites, whether free or indentured servants under 4 to 7 years contract, was not enough to meet the need of the plantations. By 1700 in Virginia, there were 6,000 slaves, 1/12 of the population. By 1763, there were 170,000 slaves,
Oh, God.
about half the population. Blacks were easier to enslave than whites or Indians, but they were still not easy to enslave. From the beginning, the imported black men and women resisted their enslavement. Ultimately, their resistance was controlled, and slavery was established for 3 million blacks in the South. Still, under the most difficult conditions, under pain of mutilation and death. Throughout their 200 years of enslavement in North America, these Afro-Americans continued to rebel. Only occasionally was there an organized insurrection. More often, they showed their refusal to submit by running away. Even more often, they engaged in sabotage, slowdowns, and subtle forms of resistance, which asserted, if only to themselves and their brothers and sisters, their dignity as human beings.
Yeah, we're fucking in control of the production,
The refusal
bitch.
began in Africa. One slave trader reported that Negroes were, quote, so willful and loath to leave their own country that they had often leaped out of the canoes, boat, and ship into the sea, and kept under water till they were drowned, unquote. When the very first black slaves were brought into Hispaniola in 1503, the Spanish governor of Hispaniola complained to the Spanish court that fugitive Negro slaves were teaching disobedience to the Indians. In the 1520s and 1530s, there were slave revolts in Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Santa Marta, and what is now Panama. Shortly after those rebellions, the Spanish established a special police for chasing fugitive slaves. A Virginia statute of 1669 referred to, quote, the obstinacy of many of them, and in 1680 the Assembly took note of slave meetings, quote, under the pretense of feasts and brawls, which they considered of, quote, dangerous consequence, unquote. In 1687, in the colony's northern neck, a plot was discovered in which slaves planned to kill all the whites in the area and escape during a mass funeral. Gerald Mullen, who studied slave resistance in 18th century Virginia in his work, Flight and Rebellion, reports,
Nice study.
the available sources on slavery in 18th century Virginia plantation and county records, the newspaper advertisements for runaways, describe rebellious slaves and few others. The slaves described were lazy and thieving. They feigned illnesses, destroyed crops, stores, tools, and sometimes attacked or killed overseers. They operated black markets and stolen goods. Runaways were defined as various types. They were truants, who usually returned voluntarily, outlaws, and slaves who were actually fugitives. Men who visited relatives, went to town to pass as free, or tried to escape slavery completely, either by boarding ships and leaving the colony, or banding together in cooperative efforts to establish villages or hideouts on the frontier. The commitment of another type of rebellious slave was total. These men became killers, arsonists, and insurrectionists. Slaves recently from Africa, still holding on to the heritage of their communal society, would run away in groups and try to establish villages of runaways out in the wilderness on the frontier. Slaves born in America, on the other hand, were more likely to run off alone and, with the skills they had learned on the plantation, try to pass as free men. In the colonial papers of England, a 1729 report from the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia to the British Board of Trade tells how, quote, a number of Negroes, about 15, formed a design to withdraw from their master and to fix themselves in the fastness of the neighboring mountains. They had found means to get into their possession some arms and ammunition, and they took along with them some provisions, their cloths, bedding and working tools, though this attempt has happily been defeated. It ought nevertheless to awaken us into some effectual measures. Slavery was immensely profitable to some masters. James Madison told a British visitor shortly after the American Revolution that he could make $257 on every Negro in a year and spend only $12 or $13 on his keep. Another viewpoint was of slave owner Landon Carter, writing about 50 years earlier, complaining that his slaves so neglected their work and were so uncooperative, either cannot or will not work, that he began to wonder if keeping them was worthwhile. Some historians have painted a picture, based on the infrequency of organized rebellions and the ability of the South to maintain slavery for 200 years, of a slave population made submissive by their condition. With their African heritage destroyed, they were, as Stanley Elkins said, made into Sambos, a society of helpless dependence, or, as another historian, Ulrich Phillips, said, biracial quality submissive. But
meaning that they had no connections to anything, so they had nothing else to think about.
The resistance of everyday life, from quiet non-cooperation in work to running away, the picture becomes different. In 1710, warning the Virginia Assembly, Governor Alexander Spotswood said, "Freedom wears a cap which can without a tongue call together all those who long to shake off the fetters of slavery, and as such an insurrection would surely be attended with most dreadful consequences. So I think we cannot be too early in providing against it, both by putting ourselves in a better posture of defense and by making a law to prevent the consultations of those Negroes." Indeed.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. He acknowledges that there is a desire to be free, but they should just be not free anyways. They should just be subjugated because, you know, that's just how it is. Because I say so. And I'm sure he had some, like, fucking godly reason, too, behind it. Knowing that times back then. Yep. All bullshit. Alright, it's got it coming together quite nicely. Plan is to take pictures of these when they're black and white. Since I got a high resolution camera now, I don't have to worry about scanning shit. Those days are long gone. That's kind of the reason why I just started focusing more on digital work, was just because it was such a fucking pain in the ass to get traditional shit scanned in. Now you just literally just your phone is enough to do a high enough quality for print-worthy photos, print-worthy art, or copies of. Got this carpet here with the boy butter on it. For practice sake too, I am going to get to watercolors in here. Color these. Regardless. If they turn out like shit, well, I could just resort to digital work at that point. No harm done. Hey, Bandit. How goes the life? I haven't even picked up on anything I've been doing, but yeah, I've been doing concentrating on this full time now, thanks to my husband's. Hope everything's going good with you. Giving myself a nice little history lesson too while I do some, work. Right. Go indeed. Right now I'm just taking this comic also. Whoa, let's not drop that. As a glass. Furry Menace. Giving it a remake because it was essentially just sketched out on cards. Oh. I have actually redecorated the room here a bit too. Oh shit, I forgot about this. I should just read this tomorrow. Instead of doing the history video. They inspired us to begin with. Eh. Might as well show off some of this. Yeah. I decided I was gonna have an art room full of dinosaurs, so I got a couple hanging from the ceiling. Oh yeah, we're upside down. That's more like it. And then I got some I drew myself behind me. And I managed to get 10 raptors on top of my monitor. A whole bunch of minis. And the one we got at what do you call it? Thrift store. And can I reach it? Oh yeah. Some Legos. Got everything I ever wanted. I don't know the core to drag over to the furry wall. That got a little bit bigger. Still proud of that wall. Alright, where are we on this? Ooh, doo, doo, doo. Yeah. Next, working on the Dargo.
Considering the harshness of punishment for running away,
I'm gonna finish this chapter
that
up.
so many blacks did run away must be a sign of a powerful rebelliousness. All through the 1700s, the Virginia Slave Code read, quote, "Whereas many times slaves run away and lie hid and lurking in swamps, woods, and other obscure places, killing hogs and committing other injuries to the inhabitants, if the slave does not immediately return, anyone whatsoever may kill or destroy such slaves by such ways and means as he shall think fit. If the slave is apprehended, it shall be lawful for the county court to order such punishment for the said slave, either by dismembering or in any other way, as they in their discretion shall think fit, for the reclaiming of any such incorrigible slave and terrifying others from the like practices." Mullen found newspaper advertisements between 1736 and 1801 for 1,138 men runaways and 141 women. One consistent reason for running away was to find members of one's family, showing that despite the attempts of the slave system to destroy family ties by not allowing marriages and by separating families, slaves would face death and mutilation to get together. In Maryland, where slaves were about 1/3 of the population in 1700,
No, I am a man-child.
slavery had been written into law since the 1660s, and statutes for controlling rebellious slaves were passed. There were cases where slave women killed their masters, sometimes by poisoning them, sometimes by burning tobacco houses and homes. Punishments ranged from whipping and branding to execution, but the trouble continued. In 1742, 7 slaves were put to death for murdering their master.
Can't imagine why they want to do that.
Revolt seems to have been a permanent fact of plantation life. William Byrd, a wealthy Virginia slave owner, wrote in 1736, quote, "We have already at least 10,000 men of these descendants of Ham fit to bear arms, and these numbers increase every day, as well by birth as by importation. And in case there should arise a man of desperate fortune, he might with more advantage than Catiline kindle a servile war and tinge our rivers wide as they are with blood." It was an intricate and powerful system of control that the slave owners developed to maintain their labor supply and their way of life, a system both subtle and crude, involving every device that social orders employ for keeping power and wealth where it is. As Kenneth Stamp puts it, "A wise master did not take seriously the belief that Negroes were natural-born slaves. He knew better. He knew that Negroes freshly imported from Africa had to be broken into bondage, that each succeeding generation had to be carefully trained. This was no easy task, for the bondsmen
You think that'd be a clue?
willingly. Moreover, he rarely submitted completely. In most cases, there was no end to the need for control, at least not until old age reduced the slave to a condition of helplessness. The system was psychological and physical at the same time. The slaves were taught discipline. were impressed again and again with the idea of their own inferiority, to know their place, to see blackness as a sign of subordination, to be awed by the power of the master, to merge their interests with the master's, destroying their own individual needs. To accomplish this, there was the discipline of hard labor, the breakup of the slave family, the lulling effects of religion, which sometimes led to great mischief, as one slaveholder reported, the creation of disunity among slaves by separating them into field slaves and more privileged house slaves, and finally, the power of law and the immediate power of the overseer to invoke whipping, burning, mutilation, and death. Dismemberment was provided for in the Virginia Code of 1705. Maryland passed a law in 1723 providing for cutting off the ears of blacks who struck whites, and that for certain serious crimes,
or just got accused of it,
should be hanged and the body quartered and exposed. Still, rebellions took place. Not many, but enough to create constant fear among white planters. The first large-scale revolt in the North American colonies took place in New York in 1712. In New York, slaves were 10% of the population, the highest population in the northern states, where economic conditions usually did not require large numbers of field slaves. About 25 blacks and 2 Indians set fire to a building, then killed 9 whites who came on the scene. They were captured by soldiers, put on trial, and 21 were executed. The governor's report to England said, "Some were burnt, others were hanged, one broke on the wheel, and one hung alive in chains in the town." One had been burned over a slow fire for 8 to 10 hours. All this to serve notice to others.
Oh, what brutality.
A letter to London from South Carolina in 1720 reports, "I am now to acquaint you that very lately we have had a very wicked and barbarous plot of the design of the Negroes rising with a design to destroy all the white people in the country and then to take Charlestown."
Yeah, why would they want to do that? They get treated so well.
But it pleased God it was discovered, and many of them taken prisoners, and some burnt, and some hanged, and some banished. Around this time, there were a number of fires in Boston and New Haven, suspected to be the work of Negro slaves. As a result, one Negro was executed in Boston, and the Boston Council ruled that any slaves who, on their own, gathered in groups of 2 or more were to be punished by whipping. At Stono, South Carolina in 1739, about 20 slaves rebelled, killed 2 warehouse guards, stole guns and gunpowder, and headed south, killing people in their way and burning buildings. They were joined by others until there were perhaps 80 slaves in all, and according to one account of the time, quote, "They called out liberty, marching on with colors displayed and 2 drums beating." The militia found and attacked them. In the ensuing battle, perhaps 50 slaves and 25 whites were killed before the uprising was crushed. Herbert Aptheker, who did detailed research on slave resistance in North America for his book American Negro Slave Revolts, found about 250 instances where a minimum of 10 slaves joined in a revolt or
250 incidents. Just like that.
From time to time, whites were involved in the slave resistance. As early as 1663...
Well, yeah, when you were in servitude, even if you're a... now, of course, it was a lot better if you're a white, but if you're in servitude as a white person, you'd be contracted, essentially, against your will, to serve a person of higher status until a certain number of years go by, and then you're supposed to be paid for by the master or owner, except that they would do everything that they can so they don't have to pay you for your retirement. They would work you to death. Hence why there was a lot of motivation for a lot of colonialists who are subjected to servitude to revolt with the slaves. Because essentially that's exactly what they were too. They just didn't get whipped and beheaded as much.
Servants and black slaves in Gloucester County, Virginia, formed a conspiracy to rebel and gain their freedom. The plot was betrayed and ended with executions. Mullen reports that the newspaper notices of runaways in Virginia often warned,
who's the cuck that betrayed that?
ill-disposed, unquote, whites about harboring fugitives. Sometimes slaves and freemen ran off together or cooperated in crimes together. Sometimes black male slaves ran off and joined white women. From time to time, white ship captains and watermen dealt with runaways, perhaps making the slave a part of the crew. In New York, in 1741, there were 10,000 whites in the city and 2,000 black slaves. It had been a hard winter, and the poor, slave and free, had suffered greatly. When mysterious fires broke out, blacks and whites were accused of conspiring together. Mass hysteria developed against the accused. After a trial full of lurid accusations by informers and forced confessions, 2 white men and 2 white women were executed. 18 slaves were hanged, and 13 slaves were burned alive. Only one fear was greater than the fear of black rebellion in the new American colonies. That was the fear that discontented whites would join black slaves to overthrow the existing order. In the early years of
once they realized how much they outnumber them.
Before racism as a way of thinking was firmly ingrained, while white indentured servants were often treated as badly as black slaves, there was a possibility of cooperation. As Edmund Morgan sees it, there are hints that the 2 despised groups initially saw each other as sharing the same predicament. It was common, for example, for servants and slaves to run away together, steal hogs together, get drunk together. It was not uncommon for them to make love together. In Bacon's Rebellion, one of the last groups to surrender was a mixed band of 80 Negroes and 20 English servants. As Morgan says, masters, quote, initially at least perceived slaves in much the same way they had always perceived servants: shiftless, irresponsible, unfaithful, ungrateful, dishonest. And if freemen with disappointed hopes should make common cause with slaves of desperate hope, the results might be worse than anything Bacon had done. And so measures were taken.
And preemptive measures.
About the same time that slave codes involving discipline and punishment were passed by the Virginia Assembly, quote, Virginia's ruling class, having proclaimed that all white men were superior to black, went on to offer their social but white inferiors a number of benefits previously denied them. In 1705, a law was passed requiring masters to provide white servants whose indenture time was up with 10 bushels of corn, 30 shillings, and a gun, while women servants were to get 15 bushels of corn and 40 shillings. Also, the newly freed servants were to get 50 acres of land. Morgan concludes, quote, once the small planter felt less exploited by taxation and began to prosper a little, he became less turbulent, less dangerous, more respectable. He could begin to see his big neighbor not as an extortionist, but as a powerful protector of their common interests. We see now
the promise of a better life. And when you're like worked to death almost.
To ensnare blacks for slavery in America. The desperation of starving settlers, the special helplessness of the displaced African, the powerful incentive of profit for for the slave trader and planter, the temptation of superior status for poor whites, the elaborate controls against escape and rebellion, the legal and social punishment of black and white collaboration. The point is that the elements of this web are historical, not natural. This does not mean that they are easily disentangled, dismantled. It means only that there is a possibility for something else under historical
post-racial
realized.
Cohesion.
And one of these conditions would be the elimination of that class exploitation which has made poor whites desperate for small gifts of status and has prevented that unity
very
of black
small gifts
and white necessary for joint rebellion and reconstruction.
What of advice I got recently? Never work to make someone else richer. One thing to collab with someone, one thing to be, equals in terms of like a business venture, but never work to make someone richer. And that's essentially what we're all stuck in, right? Whether you work at a Starbucks or just an upstart business, and the guy's like, hey, I got an upstart business, you're not gonna get paid as much, but I'm the boss. Like, well, just because you're the boss you get paid more? Well, yeah, I'm taking on all the risk. Okay, well, what are you without workers? Well, I don't have a business if I don't have workers. Oh geez, I guess you better pay me more then. Otherwise, you're not going to have any workers, and you're not going to have any business. And the thing that you're supposedly taking all the risk for, you'll have all the responsibility for. Like, every business should just be a fucking co-op. That should be the only legal business. Everything else is just a mini dictatorship. Co-op is everyone is equal ownership of the business. Anyone can look at the numbers and the books and see how much profit you're bringing in, and you decide as a collective, as essentially how much you can afford to pay each of everyone. And maybe you have shitty jobs that you switch off on. Maybe the one in charge of the books for the month can switch off and do the fucking janitorial work for a month. And there are a few co-ops that are successful in the country. I don't know all the names offhand, but you just, if you care, you look it up and find them. Essentially, the fucking owner and the manager doesn't just sit behind a desk and jerk off all fucking day while you do all the hard work. He's just as responsible for getting the fucking product out as anyone else. Because once again, what's Amazon without its workers? What's Jeff Bezos without his workers? Nothing. There's like all these trade jobs out there that are like having trouble filling their spots. And it's because they just refuse to pay. On top of the fact that it costs so much to join a trade. I had a friend who basically was threatened to be thrown into debt if he didn't follow through with his trade internship. Working at a racetrack. And he was just feeling suicidal because of all the fucking homophobia guys were giving him, even though he wasn't even out of the closet at the time. Had a supportive dad and everything, and I don't know what the fuck happened to him. He just like fell off the face of the earth. He got mad because one of my husbands said it, like mentioned like how terrible things are going in the country, and he's just like, I'm going to leave. And then we never saw him again. And it's like, what the hell? That's what you get for all the heartache you gave us, and having us listen to all your problems and figure out like how to ways to help you, and you just fuck off, and all because of your self-loathing and your hang-ups. Talk to other people about us rather than talk to us directly. Find a bunch of bullshit. Problems that I thought that all of a sudden you just have with us that you didn't have a week before. But I'm just going off on a little tangent.
The Virginia House of Burgesses declared, quote, "The Christian servants of this country, for the most part, consist of the worser sort of the people of Europe.
Worser?
And since such numbers of Irish and other nations have been brought in, of which a great many have been soldiers in the late wars, that according to our present circumstances we can hardly govern them. And if they were fitted with arms and had the opportunity of meeting together by musters, we have just reason to fears they may rise upon us." It was a kind of class consciousness, a class fear. There were things happening in early Virginia and in the other colonies to warrant it. So ends Chapter 2 of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. I gotta tell you guys, that was a rough one for me to read. There is some of those words in there that I do not love forming with my mouth.
Cry me a fucking river.
Some parts of the text are still dated since it's written in 1980. Referring to black people as blacks is rough stuff.
What about whites? Okay, this is the second time I heard this. I know. There's plenty of times that it was like whites and blacks. It's like, oh, referring to black people as blacks. It's like, well, he was referring to whites as whites. Plenty of fucking times in that book. We get it. You're not racist. We get it. You're anti-racist. But I don't make a big deal of it because it is just a small fucking nitpick of everything else. Because, the subject matter of the book is kind of like outshines any like little nitpick I have over his having problem wording some things like blacks as opposed to black people, but he has no problem saying whites. But okay. Whatever.
But he needs to tell Howard Zinn that black people are in fact people now. He can say the whole thing. But
you're just going to ignore that?
Discomfort. It's obviously a very uncomfortable chapter in general, just the sheer brutality of it. And I think that that's, not something to overlook. Like chapter 1 and 2 of A People's History of the United States are simple brutality. Brutality for profit and
I think it's very important too that he put all that shit up front, because as he even mentions in the first chapter, a lot of that shit with Columbus and their actions and the Native Americans and the colonialists and their actions, a lot of it just gets buried. Like, oh yeah, we mention it on page 562 in paragraph 6 for one sentence. But we mention it. I just need a moment before I hit the space bar. Almost done with this. And then I can get ready for the stream probably at this hour. Yo, yeah.
I mean, you could not get more clear-cut than that. Mercantilism, capitalism, colonialism, racism, these ideas are deeply threaded together. They are entrenched. They intertwine. There is no disentangling any of them without disentangling all of them. And here Zinn outlines this idea of like, and even I would have seen this, even I've heard this, in high school history classes. Like, well, if it was so bad, how I would have rebelled? Like, well, first of all, number one, fucking people did rebel.
Yeah.
And number two, that kind of brutality to maintain authority, if anything, demonstrates how unjust the system must be.
And the world we live in general.
Maintenance requires bloodshed of that level. I mean, it's crazy to me that there are people who still are like, slavery wasn't that bad. That's an insane opinion to have. That's fucking, like, you are fully in defiance of everything. But I mean, even those who have this idea of like, get over it, that was a long time ago. These events have lasting impacts that are literally written into many of our core laws in the U.S.
Here's the thing a lot of people don't get is like they don't grasp the idea like, hey, if your grandfather was really, really fucking poor, chances are your daddy is going to be really fucking poor. And you are going to be really fucking poor. Like, I can look back, even at my dad. My dad had a job in heating and cooling. He had a trade. He learned. But his best job that he had for up until his retirement, he got because there was a guy he knew. He had a friend that helped him get it. And it's hilarious to me because every single position I've had involved friends that me and my husband's made or knew. And without those connections, like, hey, if you're subjugated, like I said, granddaddy was subjugated, especially in a racist system where he's not allowed any kind of advancement. What's the chance that you're going to have? Especially when you live in a society where money is God. And I think it's where a lot of separation happens when you have poor white people and poor black people, often separated by vast amounts of mileage because one group had to run to the inner cities as refugees from the South, mainly, who were lynching them en masse. And a lot of poor Southerners who are just, well, poor Southerners. Like, well, I'm poor too. And it's like, yeah. It's almost like there's some similarities there. Like, it doesn't matter, does it? When it comes to race in that sense. Almost like elevating one elevates the other. Almost like having better social programs in terms of like Medicaid, welfare, bringing back cash welfare. Because we don't have cash welfare, we just have food stamps. They're getting stripped away again, further. It's almost like elevating those things, elevating the floor. So if, I go bankrupt one day and I have to lose everything, I'll end up on the streets because there's enough of a social safety net. But that doesn't exist in this country, and it's impossible to leave unless you're rich or get married. So you're stuck. Anyways, I gotta get ready for a game stream. So go check out Squigs at Paws Off. That's the channel. Music. much. So I didn't dump enough